In this lesson, we're going to learn how to configure firewalls. While routers can use access control lists to provide some protections and filtering for our networks, it's really that dedicated device known as a firewall that excels at using access control lists. Now, access control lists are very important for us to be able to secure our networks from unwanted traffic. A large portion of the permit and deny statements that we're going to utilize inside of our ACLs are going to be based on port numbers because those directly correlate with an application or service that we want to allow or block. An access control list, or ACL, is the rule set that's going to be placed on the firewall, router, or other network infrastructure devices that will permit or allow traffic through a particular interface. These rule sets are going to be used to control the flow of traffic into or out of our networks. Now, while access control lists can also be used to help define proper quality of service levels inside of our networks, in this lesson, we're really going to be focused on their crucial role in security of our networks and their use inside of firewalls. To configure the access control list on our firewalls, we're either going to be using a web-based interface or a text-based command line interface. When configuring these ACLs, it's always important to remember that the order in which they're listed will specify the order of the actions that are taken on a particular piece of traffic. Actions will always be performed in a top-down manner inside of an access control list. The traffic will first be compared against the first rule, and then if it matches the condition, the action will be applied and it will no longer perform the rest of the ACL. For this reason, we always use the specific rules at the top of the list and then the more generic rules towards the bottom of the list to give us the best levels of protection. Now, many devices will support the use of an implied deny function for their rule set too. Other devices, though, will not support this function, and so it's considered a best practice to always include a deny all rule at the end of your ACL to ensure that only authorized traffic will be able to enter your network. Finally, it's important to log your actions taken by our network infrastructure devices like our firewalls. Anytime a rule condition is met from the access control list, the action should be taken, and then that action should be logged. This includes any deny actions that are taken, including the deny all at the bottom of the ACL. Access control list rules are going to be made up of some key pieces of information, including the type of traffic, the source of traffic, the destination of the traffic, and the action that should be taken against that traffic. For example, this access control list has the first entry line here stating that it's going to allow TCP traffic from 192.168.0.0 to any destination IP over port 22. Now, routers can provide basic security using these access control lists and filtering rules, but it is really our network firewalls that are most commonly going to be used for network security and bulk blocking and allowing using an access control list. So, now that we've covered the basics of what an access control list is, let's take a look at how we can configure a basic small office, home office hardware firewall, and then we'll configure a software firewall inside of the Windows or Mac OS systems. First, let's take a look at our hardware-based firewall. In this example, I'm going to use a typical router switch access point combination device manufactured by Netgear and marketed as a wireless router N300 model. Now, this is probably very similar to what most of you are using in your small office or home office environments. Your interface and settings on your firewall are going to look a little different than mine, but it's still going to give you the same general idea of what kind of options there are and how you can configure one of these firewalls at your network boundary. So on the screen, you can see the basic web-based access for this wireless router, wireless access point combination device. Now, on mine, I'm going to go to security, which is where the firewall is located, and it's under block services on this particular router. Now, usually most of these small office, home office routers are going to have a very weak type firewall, and they hide it by calling it something else instead of calling it a firewall. So it'll be called block sites, block services, block ports, something of that nature. So in this case, it's block services, and I can do it based on a schedule, so I only want it to be done at certain times of the day or always. Let's say I want to block something like Telnet. I'm going to always block it. I'm going to add a block, and the block I want to use is going to be a service and go down to Telnet. Now it automatically knows that Telnet is port 23, so it's going to block port 23 for me. It's called Telnet because this is a predefined one, and then I can block it for all IP addresses in this network or only certain IP addresses or a certain range. So maybe I want to block it for everything for Telnet. That's fine. We can go ahead and add that to our list. Now if we want to add something else, let's say I have another rule. In this case, I want to block port 666 because maybe there's a game I don't want my kids playing on that. So I'll block it as port 666. I'm going to make it TCP, UDP, or both. I'm going to say both in this case, and I'm just going to call it game. And then I can block it for an IP range. Maybe I don't want it to be accessed by my kids, which all have their devices in the 10.0.0.2 and 10.0.0.10 range. If I do that, I can go ahead and hit add. And again, that adds another rule to the firewall where we are blocking port 666 over that range of IPs. And you can see how this works as you can add or delete different rules. And then I can go through and I can do another one. Let's say I want to block the FTP server. So I will just go through here and say user defined port 20 through port 21, because that is the connection port and the data ports for FTP. And then we'll give it a name of FTP. And we can do it for all IP addresses in this range, so nobody can access FTP servers. That's the idea of how this firewall works. And you can do it, in this case, it's blocking the outbound connections because it's preventing us from sending things out to the internet. Now, if we want to block things from coming in from the internet, we're going to have to do that in a different firewall on this particular device, because this one only has the outbound defined here. It's going to have what things as it's going out to the internet. Now, if I want to do this on inbound stuff, I would have to go and find that in this particular router. That's usually going to be something like port forwarding or port triggering, or something like a static route. And so in this case, I can port forward or port trigger and say, hey, if something's trying to come in on port 21 FTP, it can go and be routed to my server, which is at the .50, for instance. And so now anything that comes in that's trying to get to this router on port 21 is going to be forwarded over to that IP address of .50. So that's how you allow things in to your network based on this particular firewall. Now, how do you block things at the firewall? Well, in this particular router, everything is blocked by default because it's doing an implicit deny. So anytime I add a rule like FTP here, that's doing an explicit allow. And so anything you don't allow is going to be blocked by default on the inbound based on this particular router. Now, let's take a look at how we can configure the software firewall included inside the Windows operating system, known as Windows Defender Firewall with Advanced Security. To load this up, simply go down to your Windows key or your Start menu, scroll all the way down to where you see Windows Administrative Tools, and then scroll down again once you click on that, and you will find the Windows Defender Firewall with Advanced Security. Once you click on that, it will open. From here, you can create all of the policies you want, setting up inbound rules, outbound rules, monitoring it, etc. Once you have it set just the way you like, you can actually export that policy so you'll have it as a backup anytime you need to go back to it. Right now, you can see my domain profile shows Windows Defender Firewall is off. My private profile shows that it's on, and my public profile shows that it's on. What this means is that in my private network and my public network, I do have the Windows Firewall turned on. In the private network, I don't allow any inbound connections that don't match my rules, but I will allow outbound connections that don't match my rules. In my public network, I have it set the exact same way. Now, if I want to change that, I can go into my inbound rules or my outbound rules and decide how I want that to be done. Let's take a look at some of these rules. For example, we have this one here, which is SSH, which is Secure Shell. All of my profiles allow it. It's enabled for all of them. It will do an allow action, and it's going to allow any program to be run from any address locally to any address remotely over port 22. That may be what you want to do, or it may be something you want to block. Let's go ahead and look at some other ones. Down here, we have App Installer. For App Installer, it's allowing it to go any local address to any remote address, any protocol, and any port. This type of an any rule allows it to have a lot of ability. And so this is going to allow a lot of things through that we might not want. Now, let's say you have a program that you want to add to this. Maybe you have a new web server on this and you're going to run it on port 80. You can hit New. You can then select a program, a port, a predefined, or a custom. In this case, if it's a web server, we would want to do it based on port 80. Then we'll click on Next. Do we want it for TCP traffic or UDP traffic? If it's a web server again, it's TCP. If it's something else that might use UDP, you could set that up. And then what ports is that going to work for? For all of your local ports or specific ports? Well, if it's a web server, it again should be port 80, and for secure, port 443. Then we can go Next. We can allow that connection. We can allow the connection if it's secure, meaning that it has to use something like a VPN tunnel with IPsec, or we can block the connection and not allow any web traffic in. In our case, we want to allow the connection. Then we click on Next, and you can see which of those three networks it's going to apply to. I'm going to allow all three of them to have it applied to it, and then I'll give it a rule. Jason's web server. And that's it. Now you can see that Jason's web server is now going to allow traffic from any program, from any local address, and any remote address over protocol TCP and on port 80 and 443. Now, conversely, if I want to block things from getting in, we would do the exact same thing, except we would set it up as a block or a deny. For example, I don't want to allow anybody to do telnet into my network because telnet is unsecure. So I would set up a new rule, and from there, I can block anything on port 23, which is TCP traffic on port 23, and then I'll hit next. I'll block that connection, and I'll block it for all three of those networks. And I'm going to say blocking telnet. And that's it. You can see how easy it is to set up these rules. For the Security Plus exam, you should feel very comfortable with setting up these type of rules. If somebody says, I want to block TCP on port 23, or I want to block telnet, then you should be able to say, I want to block it from this area and let it go to that area. Now, one more area of the Windows firewall that I want to show you is down here in monitoring. Down in monitoring, you can see which profile is active, as I showed you before, but you also have access to the log file. And if you click on that, you'll be able to see what's currently there. What is being logged right now? Is it logging drop packets and successful connections? Right now it's not, but we can change that if we wanted to. Now, we can also view our active rules. This again brings us back to what those inbound rules are and seeing which ones are actually active on this profile. So you'll notice anything that's all or public is being shown here. Anything that was just private or domain is not, because they're not active for this particular connection. Next, we're going to configure a firewall on a Mac machine. To do that, simply go to the Apple in the upper left corner and go to System Preferences. From here, you're going to click Security and Privacy, and then you're going to click on the Firewall tab. You can notice that my firewall is on, but I can't click any of the firewall options right now. That's because you have to unlock it by clicking the lock and adding your username and password for the admin account. Once you do that, you can turn off your firewall, or you can turn on your firewall, and you can configure the options. In here, you can block all incoming connections. You can see what applications have been allowed through the firewall. In my case, Skype and Google Drive are allowed to have connections into my computer. And then you can automatically allow built-in software, meaning Apple software, to receive incoming connections, things like iTunes and iMessage. And you can automatically allow downloaded signed software to receive incoming connections, meaning this is software that you trust. And finally, we have stealth mode. What stealth mode does is it makes your firewall not respond and not acknowledge any attempts from somebody to ping your network. So if somebody is doing a ping sweep of your network, my computer is simply not even going to answer. So you won't know if it's up, down, or even there. So how do we add an application to this list to allow incoming connections? Well, Mac makes it fairly easy. You click on the plus sign, you find the application, for example, my chess application, and then hit add. When you do that, it by default is going to allow incoming connections. Now, if I don't want that anymore, I can simply click on it and subtract it, and it won't answer up. As you can see, you don't have the level of fidelity that you have on a Windows machine here in a Mac machine. To get that level of fidelity, you'd have to use the command line firewall tools that are provided, such as PF or IPFW. So remember, when it comes to firewall configuration, you can utilize either a hardware-based firewall that will protect all the workstations connected to a firewall subnet, or you can use an individual software-based firewall on the workstation itself within Windows, Mac OS, or Linux. Either way, the protections that your firewall will provide is all going to be based on the access control list and the rules that you configure when setting up your firewalls.